We have Victor Davis Hanson with us, a man who has forgotten more about the history of the world than most of us will ever know. He is truly a Renaissance figure, I think, in a world in which there are very few of them. I would like to get your early take of the history of the first 9 months of the Obama administration.
Well, I think we could characterize it abroad as the rise of the therapeutic mindset. In other words, there's a philosophical premise that existing problems were caused by inept diplomacy or George Bush's cowboyism, or there was misunderstanding. This is a very enlightened idea that if we were just more patient, if we were just nicer, if we just gave more money, if we just apologized, then these problems would go away. Whereas the Bush, and I think, to be fair, bipartisan policy under both Democrats and Republicans, with the exception of Jimmy Carter, adopted the tragic view that for some reason humans are flawed and there's always going to be a Hitler, there's always going to be a Stalin, there's always going to be a Ahmadinejad, a Chavez that are going to want to disrupt the international order for their own advantage. And the way that you would deal with them is to be militarily prepared, to have alliances, and to deter them. And so I think we have a return of Jimmy Carter's therapeutic mindset, and that works its way out in a variety of very interesting ways. In some cases, we really do believe that Vladimir Putin might, in exchange for giving up the checks and the polls on missile defense, might help us on Iran, even though it's a win-win-win situation for Putin if Iran goes nuclear, and they're not going to do anything. Or we might just be able to cajole Ahmadinejad or cajole Chavez into seeing our point of view, even though it's in their interest not to. And there's another current as well as a therapeutic, and that's what I call the Obama narrative. He believes that because he's of mixed racial heritage, his father has a Muslim patrimony, that he is young and charismatic, that he personally can appeal outside the tradition of America to these vast, diverse peoples abroad. And so when he gives an El Arabia interview or a Cairo interview, he basically says to the world, these are the sins of America, whether it's genocide or Hiroshima, the Native Americans, or whatever we've done, supposedly. But I am just as angry about them as you are. I agree with you on Guantanamo. I agree with you on renditions. I agree with you on military tribunals. But I'm not part of that, so don't blame me, and I'll win you over. Then he goes back to the United States and adopts a different narrative and says, really don't pay any attention to that. I'm just doing this to win people over for you. And the problem with that is you can't speak in different cadences, different voices to different audiences very long without people thinking that you're disingenuous. And so how all of this is playing out, I think, is that those who were considered enemies to the post-war order that appeared after World War II are now considered benign actors. North Korea, Iran, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Castro, Russia, and those who were allies, whether it's Britain or France or Japan or Israel or Colombia, or we're taking them for granted, and we're really not trying to cultivate them as shared equals in an alliance. And finally, the problem with all this is that an ally now is beginning to say to themselves, why, if Bush was so bad and they had to hit the reset button, but we liked America in the 2000s, were we doing something wrong? And enemies are starting to say, you see, I told you guys that even the President of the United States admits that it was sober and judicious to be mad and try to thwart the United States until 2009. And then, of course, Obama's own narrative, questions arise from that, and that is, Mr. Obama, do we really want to be liked by particular people? And is there animus toward us?
Let me interrupt.
Yeah.
What happened to American foreign policy and national security interests the last time, as you put it, I think in the Carter administration, we saw these kinds of impulses driving American security policymaking?
Well, we've seen Jimmy
How did
Carter,
it work out?
It didn't work out well because he had not only the same worldview but the same methodology in rough terms as Obama. Remember that Jimmy Carter lectured Americans that they were illiberal and they had an inordinate fear of communism. He lectured allies in Europe what they were to do. He backed away from allies like the Shah. He tried to intrigue with enemies. When Khomeini was in France, he sent out private envoys. And then he gave this sermonizing human rights lecture so that if we are an ally of the Saudis, he would rake down and send them F-15s, but he wouldn't put any bomb racks on them so to render them non-offensive. And he did this, and everybody sort of liked this. And, of course, everybody liked somebody for a while. But while he was doing this, regional bad guys, if I could use that term, in Soviet Union, radical Islam, Iran, Daniel Ortega, they all sort of said, if we try something to readjust the regional order, the United States will either not stop us or maybe secretly sympathetic with our grievances. And so suddenly we had the ongoing problem in Southeast Asia got worse in Cambodia. We had the Russian invasion of Afghanistan. We had the rise of radical Islam. We had the hostage-taking. We had the communist intrusions into Central America. And then we did a lot of stupid things. And then he kind of panicked, and he started arming radical Islamicists in Pakistan. He started to boycott the Olympics. And the impression was that he was asleep at the wheel, and he was angry. He was like a Sunday school teacher in Plains, forever sermonizing and hectoring his own people. There's a lot of that
Victor,
with
Obama. I couldn't agree more. Let me again ask you, as a historian, to back the lens up even further. My biggest concern about the forces that you've described so well here, in terms of undermining allies' confidence in us, emboldening enemies, diminishing our country. I characterize those as the Obama doctrine, basically, is that they are consistent, at least in broad thrust, with the kinds of dynamics that have given rise in the past to miscalculations and, in turn, to great conflicts, notably, arguably, World War I and World War II.
They have.
Do you think that's right or not?
Yeah, I do. I think that people, when you adopt a therapeutic view and you consider that people who are aggressive and bullying and feel that they're going to do something until stop, and you feel they're misguided, they're not educated, they're poor, they have legitimate grievances, if you have that worldview, whether it's Woodrow Wilson or whether it's Neville Chamberlain or Stanley Baldwin in the 30s and even earlier with Wilson, then innocent people are going to pay a price. There's also an example with Harry Truman. He came out of World War II. He was committed to the idea that the Soviet Union was a partner with the United States on the Eastern Front. He was committed to the League of the new United Nations. He was even convinced that after dropping the bomb on Hiroshima, he didn't need a military. He tried to disband the Marine Corps. They had a revolt of the admirals when he tried to demobilize a lot of our ships. But then, unlike Jimmy Carter, and I think unlike Obama, he learned very quickly. And so suddenly he said with Dean Acheson, you know what? We have a problem in Korea. We have to save as much as we can of Korea. We've got to save Greece. We've got to save Turkey. We've got to save Berlin. We've got to save Western Europe. And in the process, he developed what became later known as containment, and he was bipartisan. He had people like Paul Nietzsche and Vandenberg, and then he got Dean Acheson. And while Republicans and conservatives will say, well, those guys were Democrats, but they were Scoop Jackson Democrats. And they crafted a policy that stayed pretty consistent under Eisenhower, JFK, even under, to some extent, LBJ, and then on into the Nixon period, and then Jerry Ford, and then it was the aberration was Jimmy Carter, and then Barack Obama. Even Bill Clinton, for all my criticisms of Bill Clinton, he did enforce the no-fly zones. He did take out Milosevic, and he did call for regime change in Iraq. He did a lot of, I think, things that were wrong, but he was still within that tradition. But Obama is someone who fundamentally, philosophically, does not understand human nature historically or in the present, and that's
well, let's hope. Let's hope it's just a failure of understanding rather than a deeper and even more problematic agenda, and we'll get into that in a moment. But Victor, I want, when we come back, to explore with you something that you, I know, have written, co-authored with, or co-edited with Raymond Ibrahim, a piece on the Al-Qaeda reader. I'd like to get inside the head of the adherents to Sharia and the agenda that they're pursuing against the backdrop of this Obama program and all of its shortcomings that you've described so well. We're going to be discussing more of this with the marvelous Victor Davis Hanson. I just wonder if you might share with us your thoughts about the fact, as I see it, that we're really in a global struggle with these guys, not simply in flashpoints or fronts like Afghanistan and Iraq.
Yes, I think it's very hard for some Westerners who are nursed on the idea that we're in the most affluent and reasoned and leisured period in civilization's history, that anybody would want to go back to the 7th century. And therefore, when we see people who do and who want to destroy civilization in the West as we know it, we're baffled by it, and we look toward ourselves. And this is what I think President Obama is doing. Did we seem rude? Did we not apologize sufficiently? Did we not explain to the Arab world that they invented printing, supposedly, or that they were nice to Christians in Cordoba, which they were not there when the Inquisition took place, unfortunately for Obama. But this is the attitude that a lot of people have. We have done something, or we have said something that would explain this inexplicable behavior of blowing people up in the 21st century. And what Raymond Ibrahim did when he wrote compiled the work of bin Laden and Dr. Zawahiri, he showed that there was anywhere from 15 to 16 to 17 complaints, and they change daily. They can be fundamental, like American troops in Saudi Arabia, or they can be trivial, like campaign financing reform. And what they really are just excuses for a deeper anger of the West. And what's the anger? The anger is that in the age of DVDs and CDs and the Internet and disc TV, they can see that life is pretty good everywhere but the Middle East. It's good in Korea, it's good in Japan, it's good in Brazil, but why isn't it good in places like Egypt or Syria or Saudi Arabia when they have so much oil? And oil is being sold for so much money. And the answer simply is that the Middle East, as we know it today, is tribal. It has no sense. It has practices gender apartheid. It's religiously intolerant. It's not capitalist. It doesn't have free markets. It doesn't protect private property. It doesn't have free speech. And in today's interconnected global world, that is a menu for disaster and retardation economically. So people have a problem. They have, the access to understand how awful things are, but they're unable to make the needed change that other countries have made to remedy the problem. And then into that void, you have this deadly partnership between dictators, whether they're in Saudi Arabia, whether they're in Syria, whether they're in Egypt, and radical Islam. And the dictators say, deflect criticism from us, but go ahead and we will subsidize you or turn the other cheek while you trash the United States, Europe, and especially Israel. Now, that's pretty much, I think, everybody understands what's going on, and that is defeated by, reaching out and trying to encourage democratic change in these countries, and then also being very militarily prepared to strike people who act on these impulses. But when you have somebody who comes in the therapeutic mindset and says, well, because I have some sensitivity, I grew up in Indonesia, my father was a Muslim, I understand a lot of this angst, and therefore we in the past have not been sufficiently deferred to Muslims, or we haven't sufficiently acknowledged their civilization. Any of that sends exactly the wrong message. It says to the radical Islamists, you have a legitimate grief against the West, rather than if you want your eyeglasses and you want your antibiotics and you want your cell phone, then you're going to have to create a system that produces those appurtenances that you take for granted, and the system that you are presently operating on will not create the kind of wealth that you want. And that's pretty much, I see, the problem we have right now with the present administration, and indeed many people in the West.
Victor Davis Hanson, for the Stanford Hoover Institution, author of extraordinary works of historical note and about history. Let me just touch on two things that you've just mentioned quickly, because I think they warrant some closer examination. We don't have a whole lot of time left, unfortunately, but just, if you would, quickly. You mentioned democracy as something that we should be striving for. There are a lot of people who think democracy now has a bad name as a goal for American foreign policy. And the second is the idea that that if these folks want a relatively comfortable life, antibiotics, eyeglasses, and the like, they're going to have to get into a program that is compatible with modernity. What if the people who really run this operation, those who adhere to Sharia and are seeking to impose it on all of us, both A, are able to compel majorities, as we saw in the Palestinian territories when Hamas came to power, to follow them into democratic elections, and really don't care all that much about modernity and are just as happy to deny their people access to these fruits of what we call the modern world?
That's why you need a glove and a fist. And if you look at the Pew International polls, for example, for all of the caricatures of George Bush, the approval ratings of both bin Laden and Dr. Azar were here, and more importantly, the approval ratings for the tactic of suicide bombing plummeted from 2002 and 3 to 2008 and 9, from about 60% approval down to 30%. And why was that? Because the Bush administration had really tried to promote constitutional government in Afghanistan. For a time, they had been pressuring the Egyptian government. They had been working with the Kuwaiti government. They had gotten the Syrians out of Lebanon. They had got the Libyans to give up their weapons of mass destruction. They'd been hard on Musharraf, even made him lock up Dr. Khan. And there was a sense, and they were, let's be frank, they were killing a lot of jihadists in the Anbar province and in the Hindu Kush. And there was at least the image that if you were a jihadist, you were going to die if you encountered an American. And B, if you weren't a jihadist, there were avenues for change. And the problem that I have right now is, with the Obama administration, even though it's only 9 months, I think the message has gone out. If you're a jihadist in Iraq and you're a jihadist in Afghanistan, we may not be there to harm you any longer. We're tired and we may go home. And then B, if you want democratic change in Iran, if you want democratic change in Lebanon, in Egypt, we really don't want to impose our values upon your country. We feel that those are your internal affairs, and as multiculturalists, we don't have the wisdom or the morality to judge or make a moral statement that democracy is anything better.
Victor Davis Hanson, we're going to have to leave it there. It pains me more than I can tell you. Thank you so much for being with us. I want you to come back soon, if you would, please, and talk about what we do about Afghanistan and Iraq in the near future. But for the moment, let me simply say thank you to Tim Berg, our technical producer, Nick Hanlon, our producer, David Raboy, our executive producer, and the superb research staff at the Center for Security Policy. Please join us Monday, same time, same station, for more of what you need to know to ensure your freedom and security. Thanks for all of us. This is Frank Gaffney.